Well, good evening, comrades. I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's session. It's on the springtime of the peoples, the 1848 revolutions. And tonight's speaker is Marc Mulholland, who's going to talk about the 1848 revolutions and their importance in both the development of socialist ideas and the socialist movement. The 1848 revolutions are really, I suppose, the first signs of a European-wide working class movement, particularly in countries like France. But also it's a series of revolutions which occur really across the whole continent of Europe, from Ireland into Eastern Europe, from southern Italy into northern Germany. So it's really one of the first major European revolutions. And we know that it's the year in which the Commerce Manifesto was produced. It also sees the emergence of movements for national independence. And the idea of the springtime of the peoples is that for many people, it's the birth of radical democratic nationalism in Europe. But it also sees the working class as a political force, particularly in France, come into their own. And in Marx's pamphlets and writings and correspondence, we begin to see some of those first ideas of an organized socialist movement, the idea of the proletariat as a revolutionary class. Marc Mulholland has written extensively on these questions, particularly on early socialist ideas and on the emergence of what will later become scientific socialism. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's talk. And as usual, Marc will speak for around about 30 minutes, maybe 30 to 40 minutes or so. And then we'll have a series of questions and discussions and comments. So, please, comrades, join in. And I'm looking forward to what will be, I think, one of the best talks in the whole series. So over to you now, Marc.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Thanks to everybody for joining on this unusual and distracting day. For going back into history and taking our minds off the present a little bit. If we look at 1848, J.B. Taylor, the story described it as the turning point at which Europe failed. So it's the liberal revolutions which, had they worked out, would have established what you might call liberal parliamentary democracy, indeed, was the aim of most revolutionaries in 1848.
Sorry, Marc, sorry to interrupt. There is a little bit of a problem with your microphone, I think. You're cutting in and out. If it's an external one, could you plug it in better or something?
So it's on the computer. Is this any better if we get closer?
Yes, it is. And we can see you better.
Well, but looming now, I'm looming.
Thank you very much.
So I'll stick it a bit close, so you might have to engage with my chin more than you'd like. If we look at Europe in the decades between the end of the Napoleonic Wars, 1815 and 1848, the first half of the 19th century, you can find there was a kind of European Union existed, a counter-revolutionary European Union, which is known as the Holy Alliance, which is mostly Russia, Prussia, which was a large German state. Germany at this time we divided up into various states, and Austria, which was much larger than Austria is now, because Austria then was part of it, was a multinational empire. And so much of Europe was in this Holy Alliance, which is committed to preserving Europe from the threat of revolution. The French Revolution had detonated decades of war, and there wasn't much enthusiasm, certainly amongst the elites, for going back to that. And indeed, the Holy Alliance defined revolution itself as an act of aggression, by which they meant if there was a revolution in a country, the Holy Alliance felt that they could invade that country to put the revolution down, because they treated revolution as an act of belligerence, an act of aggression, which justified invasion and military conquest. So you might think this would be a very war-torn period. It's not actually in the decades after 1815. And it's partly because the states of Europe, the established states of Europe, were so fearful of revolution that they didn't want to take even one step which might lead towards it. The states of Europe didn't have parliaments, or if they had a parliament, to be completely toothless. They didn't have parliaments because they felt that a parliament would simply lead to people calling for democratization, calling for civil political reform, and this would lead into revolution. And the whole process that had begun with the French Revolution would kick off again. Now, if you don't have a parliament, it's very hard to raise taxation because parliament is really a way of getting consent for taxation. If you can't get taxation easily, then you can't raise money very easily for your government. And if you can't get money together for your government, you can't have a strong army. So this is a period of peace in the decades before 1848, largely because the governments of Europe deliberately maintained themselves in a rather weak position. They didn't have large armies, they didn't have large bureaucracies, because to take that route would mean having a parliament which they feared would detonate the revolutionary process. So the Holy Alliance gathers together amongst Russia, Prussia, Austria, what military resources it has. It pools these resources and uses them to suppress revolution where it breaks out. So this is a kind of counter-revolutionary Holy European Union. There'd also been a kind of Brexit at the same period. Britain didn't join the Holy Alliance. Britain, which saw itself, and indeed was, as the leading liberal power in Europe, wasn't exactly revolutionary, but it wasn't enthusiastic about the Holy Alliance either. So the leading statesperson of Europe at the time was the Chancellor, the Prime Minister, in effect, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was von Metternich, known as the kind of horseman of Europe. He felt his entire career, which was a very long career for decades up until 1848, was all about maintaining the balance of power in Europe and preventing revolutionary outbreaks. And where did the revolutionary threats come from after 1815? Typically from secret societies. A secret society was the characteristic revolutionary organization, such as the Carbonari, Italian, and then spreading out to France and places like that, of young people, often young soldiers, young intellectuals and students, and the occasional peasant and worker, who are committed to revolutionary republicanism, the establishment of national freedom, the establishment of a republican democratic regime. You had more generally than this student politics, particularly the Burschenschaft in Germany, which combined, as student politics often did in these days, a kind of liberalism, democratic thinking, but also quite reactionary ideas, anti-Semitism in Germany, anti-French thinking, that kind of thing. There was the continuing cult of a Napoleon Bonaparte, and so oppositional forces included Bonapartists, as you'd call them, and there was rising nationalism. So Italy was divided up into lots of different states, Germany is divided up into lots of different states, and there are those who are arguing that nation states should come together to form nation states, most notably Mazzini's organization called Young Italy, who wanted to see the Italian states, backward reactionary states, brought together into a democratic Italian state. Young Italy was copied in other countries, Young Ireland, for example. There's Young England, which is kind of weirdly associated with the conservative Benjamin Disraeli, and the general notion of Young Europe. How was revolution conceived for these people? Mostly in the Jacobin model, Jacobin French Revolution model, which is essentially you mobilize the crowd in the cities, particularly the capital city, and you use this to overawe the rest of the country. So just as Paris led France during the Revolution, and Paris itself was led by the radical crowd on the streets, the same would happen in the coming revolution. The capital would lead the country. And this idea of a revolution effectively starting as a demonstration, becoming a riot, and then becoming an insurrection where you storm the palace or the government buildings in the capital, was the kind of model for revolution, the revolutionary insurrection, from demonstration to riot to insurrection. Now, there were revolutions before 1848, notably 1820-22 in the Mediterranean countries, which was crushed by the Holy Alliance. Much more general revolutions in 1830, where noticeably Charles X of France, the king there, was overthrown to be replaced by another king, Louis Philippe, but a more constitutionalist kind of regime. Belgium split from the Netherlands, formed itself as an independent country in 1830, and there was a Polish revolt ruled by Russia, which failed in that year. 1830 is kind of interesting because it's the year we first see the barricade as characteristic of revolutionary battles. We often think of the barricade in association with the French Revolution, but it doesn't really happen in the French Revolution. It starts in 1830, 1848 is known, as Kevin's indicated, as the Springtime of Peoples. It is also known as the Year of the Barricades, which is just as good a name. The barricade becomes characteristic of revolutionary fighting because it's very effective. It allows insurgents to establish a base. It disrupts enemy communications. And with the kind of a firearm technology of the time, a crowd behind a barricade wasn't at any particular disadvantage compared to soldiers in front of the barricade. The barricade made the insurrectionists and the old forces roughly equal in terms of fighting ability, at least until artillery was brought into bear. This is in a period before 1848 when the cities and the towns of Europe are getting very, very crowded. Lots of people are moving into the cities and towns in the countryside, but there hasn't yet been much modernization in terms of street layout. So we're talking about expanded medieval higgledy-piggledy little streets, excellent for barricade fighting. There are new models of politics before 1848, notably Jeffersonian democracy in America. America, as long as you're white and male, was becoming a democratic state, more or less, in the decades before 1848, and as such was a model for radical Europeans. Mass mobilization was regular in Ireland in particular, from way back in the 1820s. This is striking because it was a Catholic country. Catholic countries where Catholicism was seen to be counter-revolutionary by instinct, but here is Ireland with a mass movement in favour of civil rights, in favour of repeal of the Union, which is very much seen by European liberals as being at the vanguard of radical liberalism, but also very effectively using mass mobilization, mass demonstrations, which is something new. Before this, you didn't really have demonstrations. You'd have a riot and maybe an uprising. You didn't have mass demonstrations because governments wouldn't allow them, basically. So Ireland, and to an extent America, are beginning this new form of mass demonstration politics. It's also, we're also seeing in the 1830s in particular, the development of the worker movement for the first time, wage earning workers, and I mean by that. So particularly the Lyon revolt, the city of Lyon in France. There's a rebellion, workers' uprisings in 1832, again in 1836, which in many respects are the first worker uprisings and have a big impact internationally, because people are very struck by this new social force, the wage-earning working class. And of course, you have Chartism from 1839 in Britain. Chartism using this tactic of mass demonstrations, or the mass platform, as they often call it, which they've taken from Ireland, really, but connected with a worker movement, much as had been seen in Lyon in France. So it's a combination of this new worker mobilization with the modern, as it's seen, politics of the mass demonstration. By the time we get to 1840s and the run-up to the 1848 revolutions, what are we seeing in Europe? Well, we're seeing the growing pains of industrialization, which is destroying peasant cottage industry. So lots of peasants who've been working at spinning in their cottages, they're being driven out of business by the emergence of factories and so on, and they're crowding into the cities and towns. There isn't really the jobs yet for them to take when they get into the cities and towns, so it's a period of great social stress. Massive swelling of towns and cities without the industry or infrastructure to support it. The railways were spreading, and in so doing, they were spreading ideas, they're linking up, revolutionary thought across the continent. And then in the midst of this comes from America the potato blight in 1845, the failure of the potato crop, which happens on a European scale. This in turn leads to a rise in grain prices. With potato crop failed, then you have to eat other stuff, so grain prices go up.
Excuse me, I'm so sorry, Marc, but I think we've identified there's something with your microphone. When you move your head to the right, it cuts out for a second or so. So
okay.
I presume your microphone is on the left of your computer somewhere.
I suppose it must be. You don't really see any icon here. Is that better?
Oh, that cut off. That cut off quite badly, actually. There
for
a second. So maybe it's no, that's even worse.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
The middle is perfect. I think it might be because you move your head.
Try and keep still.
I'm really sorry. You must have a very sensitive microphone.
I must have. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
well, sorry about that, everybody. I'll try and keep still here. So my hands are around my neck, so I'm going to stop in one place.
Thank you. Correct.
But if the failure of potato crops meant grain prices growing up, this is bad news to most people, except actually for peasants. If you weren't relying upon potatoes, as peasants were in Ireland, but elsewhere, if you weren't relying upon potatoes, you're actually doing rather better off by the mid-1840s, because grain prices are growing up and you're selling grain. So it does mean that in the urban areas, as food prices goes up, there's great stresses and strains by 1845-46. Amongst the peasantry, things are actually looking not too bad. And this is going to help to explain one factor of the 1848 revolutions, which is radicalism and revolt in the urban areas, but not the same amongst the peasantry. 1848 is not fundamentally a peasant revolution, and that turns out to be one of the great problems for 1848, because most citizens of Europe or subjects in Europe are peasants. One other thing just is worth mentioning is that the period before 1848 sees quite a big expansion in higher education, nothing like it is now, but maybe going up to 2 to 3% of the population can now hope to get higher education. And this leads to an overproduction of lawyers and journalists in particular. That is, there's people who are qualified as lawyers and journalists, but they can't get jobs. And there's nothing like an overqualified, underemployed intellectual to produce a revolutionary. So there's a large number of liberal-minded, potentially revolutionary people floating around, being discontented but in the mid-1840s, hoping for something which would allow for a reconstitution of the state, of pushing the aristocracy aside in the hope perhaps that they could take the place, get the jobs which have become available. So how does the revolution break out? It breaks out over smoking cigars in particular. In a Lombardy, Venetia, which is in the north of Italy, at this time was occupied by Austria, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The local Italians didn't like this at all. They didn't like paying tax to the Austrians. So they effectively go on strike against paying tax. This means you don't smoke cigars because tobacco is a government monopoly. If you smoke at all, you're paying taxes to the government. So it begins as demonstrations, protests, people refusing to smoke cigars. But this from January 1848. Within weeks, this has escalated to uprisings across North Italy, spreading south of Italy, uprisings against the small monarchical states into which Italy is broken up, and uprising against the domination of Italy by the reactionary Holy Alliance power, which is Austria. Piedmont Sardinia, which is a northern Italian state at this time, on 8th of February, grants a constitution to the revolutionary crowds in the streets. And under pressure from the revolutionary crowds, Piedmont sends its army into Austrian-occupied Lombardy. And so the revolution begins in Italy, first as a tax strike, but very quickly turning into international war. Piedmont is joined, again under pressure from revolutionary crowds, the armies of Tuscany, but the Papal States of Naples, a war of national liberation in Italy. The Austrian general-in-chief, Joseph Radetzky, you might recognize him from the Radetzky March. Joseph Radetzky evacuates revolutionary Italy and concentrates the Austrian armies behind these big forts known as the Quadrilateral. The revolution really kicks off in February in France. Here there had been banquets calling, or demonstrations, first of all, taking the form of banquets, calling for an extension of the electoral franchise. This leads to government soldiers firing upon demonstrators, a massacre, which sparks off in Paris insurrection. Louis Philippe, the king, abdicates on 24th of February, 1848. Really, no one wished to defend the king. Never mind the workers, the small bourgeois, and the landowners, and even because of financial crisis, which is spreading across Europe at this time because of agricultural failure, even the financial crisis meant that the last supporter of the king really had no enthusiasm to fight for him as the big financier. Unlike in 1830, 1848 sees a republic being declared in France. The Second Republic, the First Republic having been during the Great French Revolution. And it is a socialist, Louis Blanc, who declares the republic from the Hôtel de Ville, the town hall in Paris. A provisional government is established, and it throws open the National Guard, which is a kind of police force in defense of property, is thrown open to the workers. It becomes much more of a revolutionary National Guard. And indeed, the day after the abdication of the king, armed workers petition the Hôtel de Ville, where the provisional government is sitting, calling for and securing a declaration in favour of the rights of labour. And so, as I said, by decree, the provisional government recognises that workers must have the right to combine in order to enjoy the legitimate benefits of their labour. So the 1848 revolution can be seen as the first revolution in France, which has got a very marked socialist tinge. And indeed, Louis Blanc, who is a socialist, is part of that provisional revolutionary government. It's not a socialist government overall, but Louis Blanc certainly is. As I said at the time, when the Gallic cock crows, all of Europe catches a cold. And indeed, the French Revolution in 1848 does trigger revolutions across the continent. In the days of March, as they're known, in March, obviously, there's revolutionary upheavals and insurrections in Prussia, the largest of the German states. A bourgeois civil guard takes over Berlin. King Frederick William, before a crowd which is burying the dead of those revolutionaries who'd been shot down in previous demonstrations, King Frederick William says to this crowd, "I accept your revolution. I accept that a new revolutionary Germany is going to be built." And indeed, elections to an all-German parliament are held in May. This German parliament, which is designed to bring all the German states together into a new liberal state, this parliament meets in Frankfurt at a church, the St. Paul's Church, which is there, you can still see in Frankfurt. It's a very inconvenient place to have a parliament. All the members sat tightly packed together, and there are very few and narrow gangways between these seats. Above the stage, there is a big flag with a symbolic picture of Germania on it. There's no refreshments room, there's no committee rooms. And in a way, and the galleries are always full of spectators who could menace the speakers. In a way, it shows the kind of slightly amateur element around this revolutionary Frankfurt Parliament. Everything was arranged to encourage long, flowery, and enthusiastic speeches, but there wasn't that much discussion of practical proposals in committees or in private. In a way, this has become a fundamental problem. You get lots of highfalutin speeches in 1848, but not serious getting down to work about what to do about the forces of counter-revolution. Now, as Germany is swept by a liberal nationalist enthusiasm, it also finds itself swept into war with Denmark over the provinces of Schleswig-Holstein, which is majority German in population, but part of the Danish crown at this time. This is another indication it's a distraction, distraction is probably the wrong word. It's the nationalist tensions that have been brought into liberal nationalist internationalism. On the one hand, this is an internationalist revolution, but it very easily takes the path of a nationalist bitterness, nationalist disputation. The Austro-Hungarian Empire's capital is Vienna. Vienna, like Berlin, was taken over by its revolutionary middle class, backed on the barricades by the workers. In fact, on the barricades is generally the workers who do the fighting. The emperor flees from Vienna to Tyrol, where he really hides under the protection of the imperial armies within the fortresses of the quadrilateral. A constituent assembly is elected by universal male suffrage, which meets at Vienna in the famous Spanish riding school. And after a month's discussion, the assembly voted unanimously to abolish seigneurial corvée, that's forced labor, rents, and gentry courts. Basically, Austria sees the abolition of feudalism, the liberation of the peasantry. This, in some respects, is the longest lasting social conquest of the revolution anywhere in Europe. Feudalism is abolished in Austria on the Austrian domains. It's significant, however, because as soon as the peasants get their farms, get their land, no longer are under the seigneurial authority of the landlords, they're more or less happy. And the peasants cease to be a revolutionary factor. If anything, the peasantry in Austria and elsewhere look upon the cities and towns as being hotbeds of revolutionary socialism. They're hostile to it. And so, as I was indicating earlier, 1848 sees the peasants more or less on the side of counter-revolution. But where nationalism was powerful, that certainly did add a powerful element to revolutionary dynamic. Most notably, a significant part of the Austrian Empire was Hungary. Hungary establishes its own government, leaving it only nominally under the authority of the Austrian crown. And indeed, by 1849, Hungary will declare itself to be completely independent, an independent republic. The entire kind of imperial armed forces in Hungary, almost all of these armed forces joined the revolution, because they're made up of Hungarians, and they joined the revolution from the outset. So Hungary is particularly powerful as an epicenter of revolution. Going back to France, France, as we've seen, had an important worker socialistic element to the revolution. And this took the form partly through Louis Blanc, the socialist who's in the French revolutionary government. Louis Blanc and another minister, Alexandre Martin, is actually just known as Albert Ouvrier, that is Albert the Worker, that's what everybody calls him. Louis Blanc and Albert the Worker are given their own commission to talk about workers' issues, and they're given a palace in which this commission can meet. It's the Luxembourg Palace, which actually had been the equivalent to the House of Lords. And the Luxembourg Palace, from being a House of Lords, becomes, in effect, a workers' parliament, with all the various trades sending their representatives. And the Luxembourg Commission comes out in favour of workers' cooperatives, production cooperatives, to be established with the support of the state. this doesn't happen. Instead, what does happen is national workshops. And national workshops, they're designed to look a bit like workers' cooperatives. In reality, they don't really amount to that. They amount, in effect, more to a kind of work for welfare scheme at a time of mounting unemployment. And they were quite expensive. By April, a lot of Europe looks a bit like by April, across much of Europe, the revolution has advanced very considerably. Governments have retreated very considerably. However, nowhere are the governmental, except for France really, nowhere are the governmental forces of the old crown, nowhere have they actually been stewed down or broken up or demobilized. So what you have is revolutionary governments, but the crown still in place and the armed forces, the armies of the crown, still in place, the power not broken. So it's beginning to look already by April that the revolution will go one way or another. Either the crown and the armies will come back, or the revolution will radicalize, will actually begin to break apart the old counter-revolutionary state apparatus. And in many respects, all of this comes down to Britain, at least that's felt at the time. In April, everybody's looking to Britain because Britain has got the mass Chartist movement, a mass democratic worker movement. If Chartism can come to power in a revolutionary outbreak, then the feeling is it will swing the European revolution decisively to the left. What actually happens in April in Britain is the mass Chartist demonstration, Kennington Park in London. The government treats it as a threatened revolution. They ban effectively the procession, which is to take place from Kennington Park to Parliament, and the Chartists back down. It's not very apparent at the time, but it becomes apparent fairly quickly in retrospect that this is the end of Chartism. The government had called the bluff of Chartism. Chartism is unable to overthrow the regime in Britain, and that has got wider European implications. Really, the defeat of Chartism is the point when people begin to think, well, actually, perhaps the European revolution has gone as far as it can do, and it can't go far enough to break the old power of the crown and the crown's government, army and police apparatus. The next key point in the revolutions really is what happens in June in France. Even from the end of April, we can begin to see a drift to the right within the provisional government in France and in French public opinion in general. In particular, the peasantry are being mobilized against the revolutionary capital of Paris and the revolutionary cities in general. The peasants look at the national workshops, which have been established to deal with urban unemployment. They see they're very expensive. They're leading to a new tax of 45 centimes in the franc, and they don't like it very much. So the peasantry is, to a large extent, moving to the right, as are the middle classes in the urban areas. So the initial revolutionary unanimity is breaking apart. In June, the government moves to shut down the national workshops in Paris and to tell workers in the national workshop schemes that they have to leave the city altogether. This quite rightly is seen by the workers of Paris as an attempt to demobilize them, an attempt to throw them into penury, and indeed an attempt to throw them out of the capital altogether, off to do rural work in often quite unhealthy environment. And so in response to the closing of the national workshops, there's an insurrection in the east of Paris, in the working class east of Paris, in what becomes known as the June Days. The June Days lasts for three days, is suppressed by the Provisional Revolutionary Government, which is by now a straightforwardly middle-class bourgeois government. They hand power over to General Cavaignac, who becomes briefly dictator of France, and he suppresses the June Days. In the aftermath of the June days, Louis Blanc is thrown out of the government, the left is thrown out of the government, the revolution in France moves decisively to the right. The socialistic element of the revolution is dead, having been crushed in blood by the suppression of the June days workers' insurrection. So really the June days can be seen as the point when definitively the revolution, not just in France, but internationally, begins moving again to the right. In September of 1848, for example, Republican deputies in the German Frankfurt Parliament summon mass demonstrations in order to back them up against the growing strength of the right wing. The majority in the Frankfurt Parliament call upon the monarchical governments of Prussia, Bavaria, and Austria to provide royal troops in order to suppress these demonstrations. And so the Frankfurt Parliament, which at least on the face of it is supposed to be revolutionary, is now hiding behind the royalist reactionary armed forces of the Germanic royal houses. And this, of course, gives confidence as they put down the radicals in Frankfurt, shattering the barricades in every direction. The emperor in Austria gets new confidence, raises the imperial standard against democratic revolution, and revolutionary Vienna is reduced by an overwhelming pincer force, Croat army led by Jelačić, Windischgratz leading a Bohemian army from the north, and Vienna is taken on the 31st of October. Many radicals are immediately taken out and shot as the royalists take over Vienna again. Vienna is put under martial law. All democratic resistance is crushed. Austria now, having secured its rear, if you like, then turns in Hungary. Hungary which is moving towards independence. And they're able to use the national question. Hungary's got large minorities in it. Indeed, the Magyars, who are the kind of the pure Hungarians, aren't themselves actually a majority in the Hungarian kingdom. They're only the largest single ethnic group. And the crown, the Austrian Empire, is able to mobilize Czechs, Slovaks, and Croats against these nationalist revolutionaries. So if you like, the smaller nationalities are being played against the bigger nationalities. Same thing is happening in Germany. In Prussia, the army had always remained deeply hostile to the revolution. And as the National Assembly of Prussia radicalizes, the King Frederick William imposes counter-revolution by force. Berlin is taken by storm and is placed under martial law in November 1848. The revolutionaries don't really have any response except an attempt at attack strike. So what's happening really is that across the continent, the monarchical regimes who have never lost control of their armed forces are able to push the revolution back to reoccupy the revolutionary cities and towns. The revolution had gone further. A republic had been declared in France, of course, as we've seen, but nonetheless, reaction is also happening in France. In December 1848, Louis Napoleon, Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew, presents himself in the presidential election. He actually presents himself as the working class candidate. He talks in favor of the organization of labor, which is another way of talking about setting up worker cooperatives. He writes a book called The Extinction of Poverty.
Oh, Marc, sorry, we've totally lost you now. Yes, it's gone very quiet there all of a sudden.
Completely gone now?
Now we're back.
Okay, right. I'll try and keep it closer. Yeah, apologies. It's clearly not a great microphone. So Louis Napoleon, the presidential election of 1848 in France, presents himself as the worker candidate, as the peasant candidate, presents himself as something to everybody, including the anti-Semitic candidate. So one of his slogans is "Down with the Jews and the speculator Rothschild." And Louis Napoleon, mostly on the basis of peasant votes, of peasant hostility to the urban revolutionary cities, is elected as president. And so the revolution hasn't seen a counter-revolution back to the monarchy, but it's seen a new authoritarian regime coming into existence, led by Louis Napoleon, who will make himself Emperor of France in 1852. So by 1849, the revolution looks pretty much like it's been defeated everywhere. In that year, Frederick William refuses to accept the crown of a united Germany if it's tainted by revolution. Republican risings in Prussia, Saxony, Baden, and Bavarian Palatine are suppressed by royal forces. And in May 1849, the revolutionary Frankfurt Parliament is finally closed down altogether. Meanwhile, the Austrians, after hard fighting, suppressed in March 1848 the revolutions in Italy. Particularly heroic last stands in Italy, notably in Venice, which is governed by a revolutionary dictator, Jewish lawyer called
And you're gone again, I'm afraid. There's something a bit wonky there.
Yeah. Sorry, it's all the microphones in the computers. There's nothing really I can click here to make it.
No, it works again now. It's very temperamental. Sorry.
No, temperamental. So Manin, who is a kind of romantic leader of the revolution in lovely Venice, becomes a hero for the 19th century, but nonetheless the revolution suppressed. The Roman Republic is again suppressed, led by Mazzini, the great Giuseppe Mazzini, the great revolutionary, and military defense being led by Garibaldi, who would go on to be revolutionary military leader in the unification of Italy. So the revolution goes down in a pretty impressive form with the defense of Venice and Rome, but it still goes down. Three Catholic powers, France, Spain, and Austria, offer their armies to overthrow the Roman Republic and restore the Pope to his authority. Rome falls on the 30th of June, 1849. The last revolutionary outpost is Austria, which in many respects is the strongest because it had its own army, which it had inherited from before the revolution. And it's only put down by Austrian armies backed up by the armies of Tsarist Russia. So finally, in August 1849, the Hungarian Republic is crushed and a reaction has been victorious. So something to talk about, but why the reasons for the defeat of revolution in 1848. One reason is very clear: the appearance of proletarian revolt, most evident in France with the June Days, but evident all across the continent. The middle classes are very unwilling to push revolution too far for fear of what the proletarian mob might do. And indeed, the middle class revolutionaries look to the royalist armies to help them put down proletarian uprisings. But in so doing, of course, they allow the royalist forces to then, in turn, crush the liberal middle class revolution. So 1848 is the turning point, really, when the bourgeoisie cease to be revolutionary and the proletariat become the new revolutionary class. Other fundamental problem is that the royalist armies are never taken over by the revolutionaries. If you don't crush the military forces of reaction, reaction will win, and that becomes very clear by 1849. Thirdly, arguments between nationalities, which limited revolutionary international solidarity. The Germans were unwilling to help the Italians, for example. There was fighting between the Germans and the Danish. The French were uncertain at all about helping the Germans. So revolutionary forces are divided along national lines. And probably one element that's worth saying is that 1848-49 are very bad years for cholera, the disease cholera. That probably doesn't help the organization of the working class movement in the urban areas. So the revolution defeats, but just on the last point, the revolution is defeated, but in some respects it creates a new and revolutionary Europe. Until 1848, the established elites of Europe had been frightened of revolution. But then revolution comes in 1848 and the revolution is defeated. So for the old regimes which survived that revolution, at least for a number of them, they get a new confidence that perhaps they can establish a parliament and use a parliament and take risks without fear of all of this escalating into revolution. And the 1850s, you have the Crimean War. The Crimean War is a war between Britain and France on the one hand, Russia on the other. Russia is defeated, and for a period retreats out of European politics. So Russia is no longer...
Sorry, Mark, I think it's when you're leaning to that side, it's worse than when you're sitting in the middle. Try again, sorry, it was just...
So when Russia's defeated in the Crimean War, they kind of retreat from European politics, and in so doing, they are no longer available as a counter-revolutionary force, at least for a period of time. So Russia, which had helped defeat the European revolutions of 1848, 10 years later, is no longer such a counter-revolutionary factor. Austria, which had been neutral during the Crimean War, Russia feels that Austria had abandoned them. So Austria, as the counter-revolutionary most significant power of the continent, feels itself to be, 10 years later, as isolated. And so these new post-revolution regimes are not themselves revolutionary, but they're able to use quasi-revolutionary methods to appeal to parliamentarianism, to appeal to nationalism, even to appeal to elements of liberalism in order to push forward with their own nation-state projects. So it's very much because of the aftermath of the 1848 revolution that we get a new Europe being built, most notably in the 1850s and 60s, the unification of Italy and the unification of Germany, which makes a Europe which is fundamentally and radically different from that which had gone into 1848. I'll leave it there. Apologies for all the for the sound microphone things. I hope you managed to pick up some of it.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. I'm just trying to make sure that I've got host attributes. Yeah, that was really interesting. The Industrial Revolution gathering pace and this toxic inequality. I was kind of fascinated by these cities swelling, but without infrastructure. It must have been a time of real stress and fracture. But the majority were peasants, so they weren't. They sadly weren't as engaged in the turmoil, the radicalism and revolt. We're going to take Q&As now, comrades. So please put your questions in the Q&A section or in the text, and indicate, please, if you are happy to have them read out. We're going to go first to Alan.
Right. One of the things that came up in the chat was about the role of capitalism. Was capitalism at this stage? It had been rising. It had been sort of progressive in relation to other previous forms of economic social structure. Was it thoroughly reactionary, or was it in a very contradictory state, a very contradictory role? The point has been made that sort of liberal capitalists tended to side with the most, when faced with the proletarian rise of proletariat, were quite scared of that, quite rightly, and sided with very reactionary elements, with monarchists and so on. But I would think there was personally, I think it was more of a contradictory role that it had, but I'd like that sort of explored a bit and some comments on that.
Thank you, Alan.
Can't hear you.
It's wonky again, unless you muted yourself. No. Could you maybe shake your computer a little bit or bang it?
There we go. Lovely.
Okay. Yeah. so I think it's right to say that it's a pretty contradictory situation, that the middle classes are, they're pretty liberal in general, in 1848, certainly the run up to 1848. London Illustrated News said during 1848, this is because the middle classes want to have a role in government. They're quite clear. They just call it a bourgeois revolution in effect, and that's kind of what's going on. But it's a bourgeois revolution with a substantial working class element, and that's where the contradiction comes in, I think. It's most obvious in France, because there you've got a really quite significant worker movement, and you get the Days insurrection in Paris, and so the revolution splits quite dramatically. But it's more general than that, in the working class, quite a small minority of the European population. But of course, the revolutions are happening in the cities and in the towns, and the working class are not such a small minority in the cities and in the towns. So whilst the great mass of the population is present, the revolutionary dynamic is mostly happening in the cities and the towns. The workers do the fighting, the barricades, but the middle class politicians are very anxious to put them back in their box as soon as the barricade fighting has been done. If they can't do this, then they look to the royalist army to put the workers back in their box. But in so doing, of course, to give the royalist army power, they empower the counter-revolution. So the contradiction is really that the middle classes are liberal, they're genuinely liberal, but they can't find a way through to imposing their liberalism without mobilizing the working classes. And as far as they're concerned, the working classes are too powerful to be safely mobilized anymore. So I think that's the fundamental contradiction. Whether Britain looks a bit different, whether you could have had a workers' government on its own 2 feet in Britain, it's possible with Chartism, but Chartism itself can't find a way through.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mark. I've got a question about whether or not how much of this. You seem to have been talking about a lot of events in Europe. I'm just wondering about why this seemed to have escaped here somewhat. In the UK, sorry. I know we're global, but yes, I'm in the UK.
Well, at the time, of course, UK has 2 halves. One place you'd certainly expect a revolution is Ireland. The straightforward answer there is Ireland.
Mark, I'm going to have to just interrupt you there. I think periodically your mic goes out of sync. It's such a shame. You kind of have to. Yeah, you kind of have to sit in the centre ground, which is where we know politics goes to die, but not tonight. Certainly not.
Very symbolic. Yeah. How's this?
Back now. Perfect. Thank you. Thanks.
So UK is in 2 halves. There is revolutionary potential in Ireland, no question, but Ireland also has the famine, and it's just too prostrate. 1 million people die in 5 years in Ireland out of a population of 8 million. There is a rising in Ireland in 1848, but it doesn't add up to very much. Britain, you do have the mass Chartist movement. Probably the peak of the mass Chartist movement, you can argue, some people would say 1839, I think 1842 actually, but 1848 does see a big growth again. But in a way, the British government is too well prepared. And the middle classes in Britain are not revolutionary. That's the fundamental thing. The middle classes since 1832, they've got their vote. They're happy enough with things. So the revolution in the continent is based upon a worker middle class alliance. In Britain, if there's to be a revolution, it would just be a worker revolution. And they don't really have the resources to pull that off, but the middle classes aren't interested. Whilst in the continent, you do have the middle class worker alliance. The problem there is that it's a fragile alliance, but after the initial victories, it falls apart.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I think we've got Steve. Are you? Could you start your video, please, Steve, and then you'll be able to
unmute myself. That was you know, a very good overview of the whole situation. It put a lot of things together for me. So just thinking about what you said, or maybe highlighting some of the things you said. One thing I do agree with, that 1848, the democratic, let's call them democratic revolutions, okay? They're democratic revolutions. The thing about 1848 is that it's the last time the bourgeoisie can lead. The bourgeoisie don't lead as in internationally anymore. The bourgeoisie, which in a previous epoch were maybe the leading of these revolutions, they've become counter-revolutionary at this point. They've already become kind of incorporated into the system. So they are counter-revolutionary, and Marc says that. You said that. Marc says something like that as well. So that's an important point. So in a sense, after this, the only classes that could possibly lead a democratic revolution after this point is either got to be the peasantry or the working class. And I don't suppose we have any more. I'm just trying to think about this as I'm thinking about it. I don't think we have any more. I don't think we have any more revolutions till nothing like this until 1917, 18, when we have a new round of democratic revolutions. This time they become republics, because these are only potential republics, but republics are defeated everywhere, apart from in France, where you get this Bonapartist republic. But everywhere else, the republics are lost. But as you point out, you end up with constitutional monarchies, more like forms of constitutional monarchy. Actually, the monarchies are restored, but as you say, afterward, parliaments come back. So it's almost a bit like England, where we nearly have a republic, or we have a republic for a bit, we actually end up with a constitutional monarchy. And the same thing's happening here. We nearly have republics in most of these places, and then they end up with constitutional monarchies. Ireland, as you say, is one point, but for the reasons that you gave, Ireland would have been Republican, I'm sure, if it hadn't been, as you described, laid low by the situation. But interesting, the Chartist movement, which was a revolutionary movement, it wasn't a Republican movement. It had a Republican wing to it, but as a program, it never had the program of trying to overthrow the constitutional monarchy. What it really wanted was suffrage within the constitution, within. It accepted the system from the word go, and therefore it was incapable of dealing with Wellington and everything that happened in April, etc., etc. So I think these are very important examples of republicanism, how it failed republicanism. And what we got afterwards was a kind of forms of constitutional monarchy in Italy, as you describe it, and of course in Germany with Bismarck and all those other things. I think it's not, I thought it was going to be a question, but I don't think it's ended up with a question, but never mind, it's a contribution, let's call it that.
Excellent contribution. Thanks, Steve. Marc, do you want to respond?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, good. I agree with all of that, and so I suppose only thing I'd add, just because it strikes me as strange, is that not only are the Chartists not against the monarchy, which I can kind of understand. Victoria is very popular with the people at the time for various reasons, but it doesn't criticise the House of Lords, which is weird, because the House of Lords has got an absolute veto on legislation. But let's say the Chartists had got their 6 demands, then you would have had a democratic House of Commons and an undemocratic House of Lords, and you would have had dual rule. So it would never have lasted. It would have gone one way or the other.
Yeah.
Thanks, Marc. We're going to go to Matthew now. While we're taking Matthew's question, can I remind comrades to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat, or raise your hand? Thanks, Matthew.
Hi, comrades. A couple of things. I think the one thing that always impressed me on this one is, of course, how revolutionary France is in the 19th century. And it would be interesting if you've got any idea in terms of the evolution of politics within France, obviously through the whole series of revolutions, and as Marc points out, the rise of the charlatan Louis Bonaparte, Marx's great book, The 18th Brumaire. The other thing, of course, is actually the rise of Marx and Engels, and of course the publication of the Commerce Manifesto, which is like actually the month before or thereabouts. I think it's February 1848. It's actually published, and then the evolution of that current, from precisely arising out of the revolutions of of 1848 and moving towards the setting up of the first international some years later.
Thanks, Matthew.
Yeah, so as you say, Commerce Manifesto was published just before the Revolution in France.
Sorry, Mark, we can't hear you again there.
Is this better?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect.
So the Communist Manifesto was published, but doesn't really get.
And sorry, it got bad again.
Okay.
Try. Yeah, bang it really hard.
So the Communist Manifesto was published, but doesn't really get circulated much in 1848. Marx himself is a reasonably important opinion maker in Germany in 1848 because he's editing the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, which is probably the leading radical newspaper. So a lot of people read its stuff, but it's notable in 1848. He's mostly talking about radical democratic revolution. He's not talking about worker revolution for various reasons, but fundamentally, his priority in 1848 is pushing the liberals towards a more hardline position against the old monarchical state machines. What he really wants is mass mobilization on the streets, which is armed, which can be a counterweight to the monarchical state machines. And he's more concerned about that in the short run than he is about worker organization as such, though he is interested in that. Marx, of course, feels very disappointed, and this is where he sees the betrayal is, that basically the bourgeoisie were too cowardly. And why are they cowardly? Because they're fearful of the worker movement.
Thank you, Mark. Susan, would you like to ask the next question? Thank you.
Sorry. Okay, right, done it.
Now we can, perfect.
Yeah, I'm just wondering what part education had to play in the increase of these movements, and whether the provision of education varied across the different countries in Europe, whether that had any influence on it.
Yeah, can you hear me? A German education's pretty impressive, actually, and I think it does have an element on particularly kind of bourgeois liberal radicals. These are the people who are saying that who, if anything, are overeducated for the number of jobs available. There's lots of journalists without a newspaper. There's lots of lawyers without a brief. And these people are the intellectuals and the activists and the politicians of the liberal revolution to a large extent. You get rather less in Britain, where the education system's not as well developed actually as it is in Germany or somewhere like that. So it varies from country to country. Amongst the masses, literacy varies, but it's going up, and we have a pretty decent idea. It's difficult to know exactly what ordinary workers on the barricades are reading, but you have a certain sense because we know the slogans they have, we know the arguments they make when they're arrested and they're trying to justify themselves in front of the gendarme or whatever, you know, that they are aware of social and political thought which is out there. So I think we can say that a rising literacy means that at least for the kind of vanguard of the workers, there is a reasonably developed consciousness. For the educated bourgeoisie, I think education is just vital. It's why they think they should be in governments, not these aristocrats. They're the people of the education. If careers should be open to talent, and they have got the talent, that'll be their feeling very much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Susan. I'm not seeing any current questions, so I think we'll be. Yeah, I think what I'll do, Mark, is I'll give you. Would you like to take 2 or 3 minutes to summarise, and then we'll close today's event. Thank you.
So I think probably the first and most important point I'd want to make is that I really should get a decent microphone for this thing. I'll find another computer to use. Secondly, yeah, I think it's the 1848 revolutions. Kevin told me the name was Springtime of Peoples. And there was that feeling, there was this feeling that this is something which Europe had been waiting for. And there's an expectation that this is going to happen. It's an unsurprising revolution to that extent. The elites had feared it for decades. The masses had hoped for it. And the middle classes felt ready for it. So in that sense, the first weeks of the revolution just sees the old regime seeming to collapse. It looks like a very easy revolution. In that sense, is all the more disappointing for people. Things begin to, when the revolution begins to fall apart and the old regime is able to re-establish itself. To some extent, you might say, well, how do you avoid this? And the short answer is, this is why any revolution happens. It tends towards unanimity at the beginning, and then it polarizes. It divides. Very often,
oh, you've gone again, Mark, I'm afraid. If we...
So is this better?
Perfect.
So it's to consolidate the revolution really required a much more militant approach to disarming and demobilizing the royalist governments, armies and police, and replacing them with revolutionary armies.
Mark, it's gone again. Dang it, quickly, that worked for a little while.
Oh well, we're almost there.
There we are.
1848 is two lessons. One, that you can't half make a revolution. A revolution is either made properly or defeated. The second lesson is a broad historical lesson, which has been raised in the discussion, that this is A.J. Taylor said, this is a turning point where Europe fails to turn. But in a way, it does turn. It's from this period and for a long time thereafter that revolution will be something which is a working class phenomenon. 1848 is the end of liberal middle class revolution.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. A masterclass. We both enjoyed it, haven't we, Elliot? And thank you for giving us some context to the struggle on this very eventful day, hasn't it been? You won't have been aware, but in the chat threads, the thanks have been constant, but and may have escaped your notice. We're going to have a whip round and buy you a mic. I think the consensus, comrades, isn't it? But what a day it's been. So look, relating to today's events, do check out the Labour Left Alliance website. Model motions are in the chat, but go on the website to find them also, please do. And next week you must join us, comrades. Tell your friends. It's Chartism, the world's first working class party. That's not what to miss, is it, Elliot? Eh? So millions of people signing protests, millions, and that reminds me. That reminds us, doesn't it? There's a petition to reinstate Jeremy Corbyn. Hang on our website. I popped that in the chat as well. Comrades, good night. Thank you, Mark. Educate, organise, fight. Good night. Good night.